Good morning, everybody. If you don't know me, my name is Stephen, and I'm the lead pastor here. I get the privilege of leading this church along with our elders and our incredible staff. On behalf of all of them, thanks for being here this morning. We are so glad you're here. We are in the series called Redemption is Greater Than Religion. Redemption is the undeserved ransom payment for your freedom. Religion is the strict adherence to a moral code in order to produce your own freedom. Redemption is about what God produces for us. Religion is about what we try and produce for ourselves. And so we want to be a church that is all about God's redemption. And so this morning, we're going to continue on with this series, and we've been looking at Luke chapter 14. If you have a Bible, you can open up to that. If you do have a Bible, we'd encourage you to bring it every week. If you don't have one, go pick one up. If you can't afford one, we'll buy one for you. Or if you have a smartphone, you can download the Bible app right to your phone. It's amazing. But we go through it every week because we believe that God teaches us from it because it's as live and relevant today as it has ever been. In this series, what we're doing is we're contrasting redemption, what God does for us, and religion, what we try and do for ourselves. And it is clear in the scriptures, and I think when we actually experience both, that redemption is so much greater than religion. Redemption is freeing. It's joyful. Religion is it's exhausting. We want to be free from that. Some of you may be here this morning because you thought religion would be the answer to your problem. It's not. Redemption is, though. And the last thing that Jesus says, or one of the last things that Jesus says to his followers, is to tell them to go and to teach everyone else to obey everything that he has taught. Everything that he has taught. And so we're looking this morning at one of the things that Jesus taught to his followers. And in this particular case, it almost seems interesting. Like, why would Jesus make this so important? Why would he teach this? This is an overwhelmingly practical application to what it looks like to live the gospel in everyday life. And the reason that Jesus taught this, and there is a spiritual metaphor underneath what is being taught, but as we look at this passage this morning, what I don't want to do is be so caught up in a spiritual metaphor that we actually miss what he's actually saying about everyday life. One of the things that this passage reminds us of is how the gospel changes the way we do everything. Everything. And that there is not one thing, really, that stays the same from life before Christ and life transformed by Christ. The gospel changes everything. Everything. So in this story, or in Luke chapter 14, where we pick it up is this. Jesus has been invited to this dinner. And we called it a VIP luncheon, a very important Pharisee luncheon. And all the Pharisees are gathered here. The Pharisees, if you don't know who they are, it's a religious sect that was very popular back then in Judaism. And they had a lot of influence and control over the Jewish people. And they invited Jesus to this lunch really to watch him and hope that he would mess up so they could call him out for it and destroy his following. That's what their intentions were for him. And so Jesus gets invited to this luncheon. And he got invited, again, so that they could watch him, and hopefully he would mess up. Which, the point of the story we're going to be looking at this morning is this question. Who's on the invite list? Who's on the invite list? If you're a high school student right now, you know, your junior or senior year, you start thinking about something, your graduation party. And you already begin to write down, okay, I'll probably invite them, and I'll invite them. And if we're all honest with each other, or those of us who can remember back to high school, typically who made the list on the graduation party, there was one question we had in mind. How much money will they give me? My fiance and I, we were making our invite list for our wedding. And the wedding's in a month, and so we're going through the list, and we said, let's have a small wedding, and then our family list was 98 people. So we said, okay, well, there goes the idea of a super small wedding, so let's have an average small wedding. And we had to come up with a list. And so we came up, and, we wrote down the list and wrote all of that, and I will, pastoral confession here for a moment. There was one moment where there was somebody who was right on the brink, and we were like, should we invite them or should we not invite them? And we were like, they'd probably give us a pretty good gift. We actually didn't invite them. We did not invite them. But we thought about it. Who's on the list? Who's on the invite list? If you're going to have a party right now and invite your 10 closest friends, who's on the list? If you walk into the cafeteria and you sit down at your table, and let's pretend that your table for lunch is a party, who's on the list? Thanksgiving, who's on the list? Who would Jesus invite to your Thanksgiving dinner? Who's on the list? A couple years ago, I was living in the first house that I bought, and it was a patriotic-looking house. Not that it was red, white, and blue. It was built in 1920s, wooden, and it kind of just had that little like American feel to it. And so we thought it'd be a great place to host a patriotic party. And so we held a Flag Day party. And we invited all of my friends, and we made them all wear red, white, and blue, or we asked them to. And you can only serve red, white, and blue food. And we had a little memorial to Betsy Ross, rest in peace. And it was a great party. But we thought, let's make this a little more fun and invite some more people. So we invited Toledo City Council members, and we invited the mayor. We thought, well, let's go big. So we invited the governor, and then we said, well, let's go even bigger. So we invited former President Clinton, former President Bush, President Obama, and then we invited President-elect or to be elected. Yeah, right, just kidding, I'm not answering that. Okay? And we invited a bunch of people. None of them showed up, by the way. I'll tell you why we invited them, because we thought that would be an incredible selfie. Like me and former President Bush or Clinton or whoever it might be. Let's get them to our party. They didn't come. I will say this. I hate to admit this in public in front of other humans. We also invited Urban Meyer and Jim Harbaugh. One of them got back to me. It was Jim Harbaugh. He wrote me a handwritten note that said, thanks for the invite, can't make it, maybe next year. I don't like Michigan. I'm excited to see them lose in 3 weeks, but he scored a few points that day, all right? They were on the invite list because we thought that's an incredible story. Who's on the list? Like, who would be on your list? And why is Jesus talking about an invite list to a party? But that's exactly what he's talking about here. There is a deeper spiritual metaphor, but we can't also miss that this is Jesus talking about who would you invite to your party. Yeah, the gospel affects everything. Everything. So let's see what Jesus says. He's going to tell us who's on the invite list, who shouldn't be on the invite list, and why. That's what we're going to see in this story. And when Jesus says do not invite, the do not list, that's religion's list. And then when he says this is who you should invite, that's redemption's list. And redemption is greater than religion. This is what he says. He says, when you give a dinner or a banquet, so Jesus is going to assume something that each and every one of us, and this is probably true, once you get to that level of adulthoodness, okay, I don't know when that point is, but it might be the point when you start actually bringing something to a party, or you start hosting them yourselves and actually paying the bills and not having your parents pay for it. That might be when you become an adult. And so when you have a party, a dinner, a banquet, when you invite people over, when you show hospitality, and Jesus is assuming that you will. And if I think Jesus is also making an assumption here in this, that each and every one of us probably have a set budget on what we would be willing to spend on something. You have a wedding, you have a budget. You have a graduation party, you have a budget. You have we're going to have, one dinner party a month, and this is how much we're going to spend. Jesus is assuming that we all live within some type of a budget on how much money we would spend in this. And this is probably true whether you're, 14 or 15 and you have lunch money, or you're a lot older and you invite people over for dinner. But Jesus talks about this. He says, when you give a dinner or a banquet, assuming that you will, Jesus is, here's the do not fly list. Do not invite. Do not invite. When I was 14, I was playing high school football. I was 127 pounds. I was awesome. And after most of my games, we would invite a lot of the freshmen or the people in my class over to my house afterwards. And so one of these particular days, we were all hanging out at my parents' house after the football game, and there was one kid on our team who happened to be an offensive lineman who thought our couch would be fun to jump on. And so he jumped on it, and the whole thing cracked and broke. He was no longer invited to the party. Not by me, by my mom. Right? He's on the do not invite list. He just snapped the couch. Jesus gives a do not invite list. He says, when you throw a party, do not invite, listen to this list, your friends, or your brothers or sisters, or your relatives, or your rich neighbors. Now, before some of you use this as an excuse to not invite your in-laws to Thanksgiving, that's not what he means. It says, do not invite your friends or your brothers or sisters or your relatives or your rich neighbors. Think about Jesus just saying that. He's like, listen, I know you only invited that guy because he's rich. Don't invite your rich neighbors. Don't invite them. This is religion's list. Jesus is saying this is how we operate. We operate with this idea of reciprocity. It's so built inside of us. And if you don't think human nature does this, who gets the free meal at the restaurant? The homeless guy or the celebrity? The celebrity. The celebrity always gets the free meal. The homeless guy gets kicked out. I mean, this is how we act. Maybe this is just me, but I remember being in high school, like, just being honest, when the poor kid said, hey, I forgot my lunch and I need $1, no. When the rich kid said, hey, I forgot my lunch, I need $1, I was like, yeah, because if I give you this, then you'll invite me to your house and we're going to Qzar. Like, it's human nature. This idea of reciprocity, I do for you because you will eventually do for me then. Or I get to be seen with you, or I get to go to school on Monday, or I get to go to work on Tuesday, and I get to say, oh, what'd you do? Oh, no big deal. I just had these people over and those people over, and we had a little dinner. Jesus says, don't invite them. Now, there's a grammatical thing that we have to understand a little bit because when we read it, translated the way it was for us, it does get slightly confusing. Like there's a verse we're going to study in a couple of weeks that says you must hate, and then the point is when Jesus says don't ever, like it says in here, or you must hate, what he says later, when that type of grammar is used in our Bibles, it's translated a little differently. What it really means is the next thing, you must do much more. So when Jesus is saying do not invite, he's not saying never have a party with your friends. Never invite people over that you like. He's not saying don't ever do that. What he is saying is that the thing I'm going to get to next is actually should be done more frequently and is actually more important than this. He says, don't invite, let's look at the list again, your brothers or sisters, your friends, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. Here's why. Look at this warning Jesus gives. He says, here's why you shouldn't do that. Now, some warnings make sense. Like, don't touch the stove, you'll get burned. That makes sense. This warning, just look at it. He says, don't do that because they might repay you. You might get something from it if you do it. Well, yeah, Jesus, that's kind of why I did it. Like, that's why we do things. Because then we might get something back. He says, don't do that. Who can say that? Only somebody who is living so far outside of the values of this world. Only somebody whose life is completely transformed by the gospel can say these types of things. Only somebody who has completely been able to abandon the values of the world and embrace the values of the kingdom can do this. He says, don't do that. You might benefit from it. Don't do that. That's the do not invite list. Why? Because it might be of good to you. By the way, you know who Jesus is talking to here? He's talking to the host of the party. Side note, there's not any physical evidence that Jesus ever gets invited to another party after this. Because he just consistently calls everybody out. He's never invited to another party the rest of the Gospels. Okay, but when you do give a feast, because you probably will give a feast, when you do give a feast, here is the invite list. Religion's list is filled with these people. And listen, this is human nature. This is normal. Religion's list is filled with the people that you like, the people that it is comfortable to be around them. It's a fun Friday night to have those people over. It doesn't leave my house smelling badly, and I might get invited to the next party. That's religion's list. Here's redemption's list. Redemption's list looks like this. It says, but when you give a party, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. The poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. The poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. When you open up your house, invite the poor, the lame, the crippled, and the blind. And when you're figuring out that Friday night plan, invite the poor, the lame, the crippled, and the blind. When you're thinking about who do I want to spend these limited dollars that I have for hospitality and service, who should I invite? The poor, the lame, the crippled, and the blind. What does this list signify? What is Jesus getting after here? There is so much in here. I want to point out a couple of things. First, he talks about the poor. Why? First off is this. Jesus knew that as long as human nature exists, and it will exist as long as humans exist, there will always be poor. You can't legislate it away. You can't govern it away. You can't, rising tide and everyone lifts it away. There will always be the poor. And if there is one thing in our culture and in the cultures of the world that differentiates people, it's economics. We go to school by economics. We live in neighborhoods by economics. We shop by economics. We wear clothes typically by economics. So much of what we do, the big gap is rich and poor. It's the number one thing that separates groups of people, economics. If you just look at a census map, it proves this point. Average income in an area. We're completely, and I'm not condemning that in any way. That's not, Jesus didn't say that's where you live. Okay, so I'm not condemning that per se. What is happening here is this. Jesus is saying, when you engage with people, bridge a gap that the world doesn't teach you to bridge. That the gospel compels us to bridge gaps that the world never will. That the gospel is so powerful that it makes us look at something that the world would say, those two things don't come together. And in the gospel, they can. And they do, and they should. Redemption says they will when you have these parties. That's who you invite. Invite first the poor. This is not just a spiritual metaphor. This is actual, real life. Invite the poor. Why invite the poor? Well, there's probably a bunch of reasons. One of them is this. I think Jesus is saying, so you throw the dinner party and it costs $2,000 and, whatever it is, and you have all of that, and it fed your 20 closest friends, and it was amazing, and everybody laughed. What a party. Hey, I'll invite you to the next one. Yes, awesome, cool. That $2,000 could have fed the poor for a month. There is a part of that in this. When you throw a party, invite the poor. Bridge the gap. And it's not just economic gaps, by the way, that the gospel compels us to cross. Here's a line that I think is very true. If there's not relationships in our lives that wouldn't exist outside of the gospel, then we need to reevaluate Christian community. If there's not relationships that exist in our world, they're like, man, I would never engage with this group of people or that person in particular or whatever outside of the gospel of Jesus compelling me to do so. We have to reevaluate Christian community. And that can be black and white, that can be rich and poor, that can be educated and uneducated, that can be Republican and Democrat, that can be whatever thing that typically causes divide. Jesus says the gospel brings together. So when you give a feast, invite the poor. And if you have to picture that for a second, it doesn't look good, it doesn't smell good, and they're definitely not inviting you to a party. It says, when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. The crippled, the lame, and the blind. Here's the idea behind the crippled, the lame, and the blind. In that culture in particular, these are the have-nots, the forgotten, and the condemned. You must have done something bad to be like that, would have been the thoughts. You have to sit on the outside of society and culture. You're not welcome where everybody else is. And they can't even take care of themselves, particularly in that culture. No medication, not a robust welfare system. These are the people who have been literally thrown to the edges of society. And Jesus says, I want you to bring them in. Now, for the Pharisees hearing this wasn't just like not a fun Friday night to have those people over. This, it rubbed against all of their beliefs. I can't even engage with those people. I might catch it. I can't let those people in my house. What will everybody else think? What will they know if they know that I'm hanging out with him or her? And not only did it do that for them, what it also did is it would have made them think, well, they're not deserving. They're not deserving of anything. And they deserve what they got. The poor, the lame, the crippled, and the blind. Let them just suffer in it. They got what they deserve. And they can't do anything for me. But then Jesus says this, when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. And look at the two things he says here. Three things. He says, and you will be blessed. Two things the word blessed does not mean in the New Testament. It does not mean like a pouring on of financial money towards you. Doesn't mean that. The other thing it doesn't mean is that you'll get some great inheritance in heaven. There is that in the New Testament, but that's not what the word blessed means in the New Testament. You know what the word blessed typically means in the New Testament? Happy. Of good spirit. That's what it typically means in the New Testament. A friend of mine is studying to be a teacher, and he has to take a psychology class. And he said one of the things he recently learned that they show these studies that for people who are struggling with sadness, depression, or lack of purpose or whatever it is, the number one thing that shows up year after year and how to get out of that? Serving somebody else. Serving somebody else, particularly somebody in great need. Jesus says, you'll actually be blessed. And there's actually a joy that will come out of you when you do this. He says, but when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. Let me just translate that another way, by the way. When you give and feast, invite the people that if you didn't know Jesus, you would never invite. When you give a feast, when you spend your social dollars, when you hang out with people, or when you think about who I'm going to connect with, whether it's at lunch in high school or middle school, or it's who you're going to walk to class with when you're in college, or who you're going to invite over for dinner when you're older, whatever that might be, whoever that is, think about who can I engage with that everyone else is forgetting about, that everyone else is putting out, and that I can reach out to only because Jesus has changed me. Reach out for that person. Look out for that person. That's redemption's list. That's who redemption looks out for. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed. It'll actually produce joy. That's not why we do it, but it'll be a side effect of it. Because also they can't repay you. They can't repay you. And he's saying, hey, look for the person who there's like nothing they can do for you as a result of this. It's not going to make you cooler. It's not going to be something to like brag about on Monday. It's just, you just do it. There's nothing they could do for you. And then he says this, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. He does throw on a tag there at the end then, right? He says, you'll be repaid at the resurrection of the just. A couple things he's saying there. First thing that Jesus is saying there is going to be a resurrection of the just. Like there is going to be a day, right? Whenever Jesus in any way, not whenever, but most of the time that Jesus talks about anything that has to do with finances in any way whatsoever, he always points to eternity as the perspective builder on how to spend differently. He does so here as well. He says, someday I'll repay you at the resurrection of the just. But what Jesus is also implying, and if you want to look a little further, go to Luke 16 and read through Luke chapter 16, the story of the rich man and Lazarus and what happens there. Because the implication in this text is those who live off of religion's list won't be there. And those who invite redemption's list and live off of redemption's list will be there. In no way am I implying that this is a way that we earn our way to heaven, because then we're just doing what religion says. That's not the point. What Jesus is saying is once the gospel has transformed you, it does compel you to live in this way. To look out for those who have been forgotten, cast away, rejected, and denied, and to say, why don't you come over? Here's a way you could do this. There's someone I know who, somebody in their office, in their work environment, did something, got messed up, got fired, and it just looked bad. And I remember having a conversation with this person about that person who had gotten fired, and in that workspace, it was kind of like, the talk of it or whatever. And two things. I feel bad in that we didn't follow up on this, admitting it. But I remember sitting there thinking, we should invite that person over for dinner. Their life is falling apart. Think of it right now. Their whole social world just fell apart. We should invite them over. What does religion typically do in these situations? Runs. What does redemption should do? Run towards the problem. So here's what I'm trying to give you a tip. The next time there is somebody in your social circle who everybody else is speaking poorly about or everybody else is rejecting, that is redemption's opportunity to step in and to do the opposite. That is the gospel. Who religion rejects, redemption embraces. It's ridiculously messy. It's the gospel. It's hard. It's the gospel. It doesn't fit normally into culture. It's the gospel. It doesn't follow along our typical rhythms and patterns and systems of life. It's the gospel. It's Jesus changing us so much that our eyes are different. Who we engage in and what we think about the people that we once rejected is now different. The barrier that was once between you and those people is gone. Why? What's the deeper thing that's happening here? If there is a spiritual metaphor, which there is a spiritual metaphor in here, it's Jesus. He's always got them, right? There's a spiritual metaphor in here. And if heaven and if the kingdom of God is a feast and a party, which it is, who's invited? Who's invited? Who does Jesus invite to parties? The poor, the lame, the crippled, and the blind. The poor, the lame, the crippled, and the blind. That's who Jesus invites to his parties, which means this: if you're in, then what does that mean about you? That you were the poor, the lame, the crippled, and the blind. Otherwise, you would have never been invited. You wouldn't have been in. Because that's not who Jesus invites. And the perspective that says, I'm the rich neighbor, or I'm the one who's got it together. I'm the good brother, the good family member. I'm the good friend. If you think you're that, you're not in. But those who realize I was spiritually so poor, depraved, I had nothing to offer God. Those who remember, I was not a friend or a relative. I was an enemy of God. I was the son of Adam, not the son of Jesus. But then by his blood and his death, I became the son of Jesus. I wasn't a friend of God. I was an enemy of God. Romans 3. When we realize that we are the poor, the lame, the crippled, and the blind, then Jesus says, come on into the party. And it is awesome. And what does Jesus teach? The people invited to the party, they can't repay the inviter to the party, the host. They have nothing to offer. Jesus didn't invite you into the party so that you could pay him back. You don't have anything to pay him with. Not an ounce of your good work, not your tithe, and not all of your income, and not your service. Nothing will ever pay him back. That wasn't the point. He gave it to you knowing there was nothing you could do for him. And he brought you into the party, and it was a massive feast. This life on earth is life in the kingdom. It's like we're in the party, but we're not fully in the party yet. That's what life on earth is. And then when we pass in, we pass fully into the party. But here's a little secret for life, right? Like when it's Tuesday and the week seems long, what do? You think about Friday. When you're in life and it thinks long, what do? You think about the feast that is coming. That he invited you into it because you were poor, lame, crippled, and blind. That's why he invited you in. That's why he invited you in. He says, we come in, poor, lame, crippled, and blind. And what does Jesus do? He makes us a friend. Once we're in the party, he makes us a friend. He makes us a part of his family. He makes us rich spiritually in him, having everything. But that's not to the ticket to the party. That's like the gift once you're at the party. And this is what we'll talk about next week. Here's what Jesus does when we're at the party. He says, enjoy it to its max, live in me to the fullest, and go invite every other poor, lame, crippled, and blind person into the party. Go invite them all. Bring them all in. Let's show them how to party.